think in my book I use the phrase the great forgetting, because every form of traditional medicine basically said the same thing. You know, food is man's best medicine, talking about the virtues of exercise. Of course, everybody knew that. Something happened in the Western tradition to forget all that.
I'm now going to project myself into the future, into an ideal future, and imagine what a healthcare system would be like. I'd go online and I'd fill in a questionnaire. I mean, in the ideal world, of course, it would be a person, but I'm trying to think of, our world as it is now. And they would ask questions, ask you about your sense of meaning, your spiritual life, essentially. Ask about your emotional life, your relationships, your dream life, what your sleeping is like, your eating, your diet, your lifestyle is like. And they would really look at you holistically. And then you look at these three pillars, sort of exercise, diet, and sleep. You say at the end of this, but I only came in here because I was getting a bit of a stomachache that was persistent. You say, yes, let's address that now as well. So you're taking a holistic approach, and then you home in on the specific symptom that's being reported. That would be my ideal of healthcare, I think, in the future.
Sitting comfortably? Seatbelts on? We're off on another adventure in Nutopia. With me, David Brownwell. The voices you heard at the beginning were holistic health practitioner Peter Deadman and Philip Carr-Gomm, psychotherapist, author and druid. We'll hear more from them both later, as well as from Dr. Laura Marshall-Andrews and tech pioneer Sarah Ticho. This episode is in no way questioning the value of our Western medical systems or cherished institutions like the NHS. We will at some time all benefit from the advances of modern medicine, be it fixing broken limbs, healing or replacing vital organs, or successfully treating the likes of life-threatening diseases such as cancer. If I was to be hit by a car, I'd want to be taken to a hospital, glued back together and administered with strong painkillers, not treated with aromatherapy and a squirt of rescue remedy. As one doctor astutely put it to me, our system excels at crisis management. Yet there is a downside too. We seem to take a mechanical assembly line approach to health. We get a few precious minutes with a doctor, often down the line these days, followed by the usual procedures of tests, pills and specialists. There is scant investment in preventative or holistic approaches to healthcare. The mind, community or nature are rarely acknowledged in the healing process, or even good food. Hospital meals seem to come from a land that time forgot, 1970s school dinners with sugar levels to match and always served at room temperature. So how can we embrace a more connected and integrated approach to health? And how do we come to forget how to look after ourselves, as Peter Deadman suggested? It's a huge topic, I know, and while this episode barely scratches the surface, we are going to explore social prescription, music therapy, the use of VR for phobias and anxieties, and the eightfold wheel of the year. We'll learn about yangsheng, the principles of stop before completion, how integrative and narrative-based medicines have the potential to change our approach to health in the West, and we'll finish with the benefits of a steaming hot mug of Builder's tea. All of these we might label as medicine for the soul. Peter Deadman studied and practiced Chinese medicine for 30 years and is a teacher of Qigong. He also co-founded the landmark health food shop Infinity Foods in the early 70s, when the connection between diet and health was generally given scant regard. He's also the author of Live Well, Live Long, though given his surname, in my mind at least, a much better title would have been The Deadman's Guide to a Long Life. Peter spoke to me about the Chinese tradition that emphasizes prevention of disease and maintenance of health and goes under the title of yangsheng.
When we first started Infinity Foods, that was 1971. It's hard to believe, but the idea that what you ate affected your health in any significant way was laughed at in modern medicine. Apart from deficiency disease, they knew about beriberi, vitamin B deficiency, vitamin C deficiency. But no, all you need, as long as you get protein, carbohydrates and fats, it makes no difference what you eat. So where did this come from? I mean, one thing we can look at is the idea that medicine follows the predominant technology of its time, which in the 19th century was the machine. We started to view the body instead of a kind of living integrated system, rather as a machine made up of different parts, that either with medical drugs or with, later on in the 20th century, specific exercises to target specific areas of the body. One of the predominant technologies of the 20th century was warfare. So medicine came to be discussed in terms of warfare. They talked about the magic bullet, specific medicine that could target a specific point of the body, or the war on cancer, those kind of ideas of battling disease. 21st technology is information technology. So now people are talking much more about looking at the genetic material as a body of information that can be altered. One thing that shines out of Chinese philosophy is interconnectedness. The two fundamental core philosophies in China were, first of all, yin-yang, seemingly so simple. Actually, the more you live with it, the more profound. And the 5 elements. And really what it is a theme of connectedness. You know, how colours, plants, musical notes, tastes, climatic conditions have a connection, you know, and so the liver is connected to wood, and wood stands for plants and trees and so on. You know, the kidney is connected to cold and winter. You know, the heart is connected to fire and summer, and just really interwovenness of life. You could say Western medicine has really gone down a, you know, really valuable, but occasionally a blind alley of subdividing the body into its numerous constituent parts and looking at them individually, whereas Chinese medicine is much more about relationship within the body, you know, relationship of the organs with the sense organs, with the different fluids of the body and tissues, even with emotions, you know. So it's really about a web of connectedness rather than isolated individual units.
On a visit of my own to China back in 2008, I was struck by how chaotic the roads appeared. No one ever seemed to stop, traffic lights and roundabouts were absent, cyclists and drivers seemed to prefer to mount the pavement rather than apply the brakes. Anxious about crossing the road, I'd wait for an elderly person to arrive, figuring that if they'd made it to that age, I was in safe hands. I needn't have worried. Like flocks of birds or shoals of fish, vehicles and pedestrians there never seemed to bash into each other. In Shanghai, I noticed a government campaign to encourage people to always keep their windows open, despite the fact it was midwinter and the average temperature outside was about -5 degrees. Long taxi rides called for gloves, scarves and thermals. It all connected with their established idea of flow. Back in England, it struck me how different our approach to movement and travel. Traffic lights, roadworks, one-way streets, pedestrian crossings, complex junctions, they all add up to create a stop-start culture where, in cities at least, flow is constantly blocked. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we give cars priority over pedestrians, but it did make me wonder whether things like road rage are an expression of an anger and frustration simmering below the surface of many people and caused in part by a culture that fails to understand flow. Being a podcast in search of new narratives, I asked Peter about the metaphor of flow in Chinese culture, which led on to the principles of yin-yang and the middle way.
The great metaphors of the Chinese philosophical tradition, apart from observed nature, are the understanding, first of all, of free flow. So we have in Chinese medicine the idea that when what is called qi and blood is flowing freely in the body, we're well physically, mentally, and emotionally. And when we have stagnation, that is when we develop pain, discomfort on a mental or physical level. So a lot of the practices, particularly the movement practices and the meditative softness and relaxation practices, are designed to encourage a state of free flow. Now we all know what free flow feels like. Maybe we're dancing at a party and we feel on it and in it. Everything is flowing freely. You know, we're feeling expansive emotionally, that's free flow. Maybe we like to run, and in the middle of running and after running, our body feels full of free flow. Second metaphor, yin-yang. Yin-yang runs through everything. All of Chinese medicine. When yin or yang reach their extreme, they turn into their opposite.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm still an idealist, so just to take an example, but this is not evidence-based, this is just hopeful. If we look at human evolution, we can say that for most of our history, we lived as tribes. And then probably only in the, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, tribal society reduced down to the extended family, a much smaller number of people. And then in the 20th century, that reduced down to the nuclear family, which still held together. Divorce, separation was rare. In the latter part of the 20th century, the nuclear family split, and we had more and more broken families and more people living alone. This was exacerbated during the pandemic. So in my field, for example, we're sitting in the Brighton Natural Health Centre where we've taught classes for 40 years. More and more people don't come to classes. They stay at home on their own and follow a class on YouTube. The logic, yin-yang logic, tells me that human society can't contract any more than the individual, and therefore it must turn into its opposite. And I am hopeful that we will increasingly turn back towards fellowship and community in our societies. The third is the middle way between extreme. Vaccination actually is great. Epidemic diseases killed more human beings than any other disease in the history of medicine. When they came up with vaccinations for polio, tuberculosis, what a miracle, fantastic. Vaccinations are great, but there may be some downsides. We have to weigh it up. That's the middle way. Take no exercise, that kills you. Take too much exercise, that's pretty bad for you too. Middle way. That's a good principle for looking at things. So yangsheng literally means nourishment of life. The three great philosophies of China, Taoism, Confucianism and Buddhism, don't really suggest an afterlife. It's not like Christianity. So this life is what you get, and there's been a great preoccupation of examining with a really cool observational eye, what is it that increases the chances of living a long and healthily long life? And that's really the subject of yangsheng, which has been developed over about 2,500 years. And there is a lot of yangsheng stuff that is very obscure and very, very cultural. But the broad sweep, the broad lessons are so simple and so obvious. We spend more money on medicine than ever, and yet the incidence of chronic disease is constantly growing. So obesity, diabetes, dementia, cardiovascular disease, strokes, all are on a steady upward increase. In fact, it's predicted that most of those will double over the next 20 or 30 years. There is no way of treating our way out of what we could call an epidemic of chronic disease. It's very, very obvious that this comes from the lifestyle that we're living. Over 50% of the calories consumed in Britain come from what's called ultra-processed food. We know that this is disastrous for health, and this is spreading through the world along with lack of exercise and many other health challenges. There's only one way to deal with that situation, and that's preventative. We have to find ways to maintain health and prevent disease, and that's what yangsheng is. So the broad principle of yangsheng is very common sense. We have two sources of health. One is the constitution we inherit from our parents, which varies from individual to individual. The other is the inputs we receive from the world around us: food, drink, connection with nature, music, love, affection, friendship, dancing. These all build physical and mental well-being and energy. And the idea is that if we can maximize the health of the body organs particularly, we maximize our ability to receive nourishment from these sources in the world. And if we live in a kind of reasonably intelligent and moderate way, we don't exhaust, we don't dissipate our resources. I actually mentioned 4 legs of the chair in the book. The first and most important is finding a way to get some level of ability to manage our emotional life. If we're at the mercy of our emotions, if our emotions are chaotic, it's very difficult to look after ourselves. I mean, if you look at anger, for example, very common emotion, anger is really, really toxic. It increases the risk of cardiovascular disease, increases the risk of cancer, it injures the lungs, worry, anxiety, all these have similar negative effects on the body. To learn to gain some level of control over our emotional life is vitally important. Second is diet, but for most of us, really the message nowadays, just eat real food. I mean, Michael Pollan wrote a book in defense of food. His 9-word mantra was eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's actually 7 words. The third leg of the chair is movement and exercise. So all movement is great for the body. We evolved over hundreds of thousands of years as moving creatures. Our life required constant movement, whether it's running, walking, pounding grain, climbing trees, playing games, dancing, and so on. We've reduced natural movement in modern life down to a bare minimum. It's possible for many people to wake in the morning and go to bed at night and barely have moved. We farm ourselves out to the gym and do an hour's exercise, but often the rest of the day we barely move at all. So I love conscious exercise. I practice Qigong, but I'm also very aware of the need to just move as much as possible, walk, climb stairs, garden, play games, whatever, And the fourth leg of the chair, sleep. Sleep must be the most magic medicine in the world. I mean, we're so used to it, we take it for granted, but how often do we end a day exhausted, mentally and physically, knackered, We go to bed, if we sleep well, we wake up, ta-da! Whole day, we can go through a whole day again. That is, if you could put that in a bottle, that would be a miracle. So we live in a sleep-deprived society, and the importance of sleep is being understood more and more.
Keeping in the realm of preventative approaches to health and well-being, the Chinese have some great proverbs that many of us, this presenter included, could do with taking more heed of.
Every Chinese person knows, stop before completion. Eat till you're 7/10 full. Don't eat till you're full. Leave the table with a little bit of hunger. Don't overload your stomach. Go to the next meal with a little bit of hunger. That will make the food taste even better. Stop before completion with that meal, and so on. We don't have to count calories. Just don't be frightened of being a little bit hungry. Stop before completion in exercise. Stop before you're exhausted. In stretching, stop before 100%, so the tissues stay soft and released.
Philip Carr-Gomm is a psychotherapist, author, and was head of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids for 32 years. While, as Peter Deadman pointed out at the beginning, much of our ancient wisdom around preventative approaches to health and well-being has been lost, pagan practitioners, for want of a better phrase, such as Wiccans or Druids, can bring a wisdom of their own through old and new holistic traditions.
One of the causes of ill health, I believe, is homogeneity. In other words, sameness. It's like, I think, as human beings, we need variety, and we need pattern, and we need rhythm. And there's a way in which our modern society is geared towards sameness, in as much as, let's get a system that keeps our house the same temperature all year round. Let's get air conditioning and so on. Let's become oblivious to the pouring rain outside and the storms and to the sweltering heat, so we can just keep producing for the machine. There's a way in which people in urban environments who are really under a lot of pressure from work and from everyday living can go for months without knowing what cycle the moon is in, even possibly what season they're in, because they're going from one air-conditioned box in another metal box to another air-conditioned box, so that they can look at a box during the day of their computer and then go back in the box to look at another box, which is their TV. But we need variety. And so one of the things that the Eightfold Wheel of the Year does is it presents you with this beautiful pattern that has a pattern in it and a cyclicity and a rhythm in it, but it's also constantly changing. And it encourages you just to be more aware of that constantly changing pattern and these sort of key moments like the solstices and the equinoxes and so on, where things shift and change. And that's like introducing, an analogy would be introducing variety into your diet. A certain pattern to it. You need some fruit, you need to eat vegetables, and you need so on. But you're not just eating the same thing every day, day in, day out. You can look at the practice of the Eightfold Wheel of the Year, working with the Eightfold Wheel of the Year, in the sense of working with a container for yourself in the world of time. So we're all aware of how we're beings living in time, and we were born, and then we're moving on this sort of inexorable, apparently, line towards our demise. And for those of us in a kind of secular world, perhaps without a spiritual worldview, the only markers in that are perhaps Christmas, New Year, the summer holidays, something like that. And that provides some kind of marker, some kind of containment for our anxieties and for the part of us that looks forward and back. But imagine instead of just those markers, you had 8 markers. Every 6 weeks or so, you had a marker that was filled with significance that, with folklore and tradition, and you could remember back to the previous festival, and it connected you to the outside world and what was happening in the world of nature and so on. That's a much more satisfying container that keeps coming around each year. So from a mental health perspective, it's hugely helpful, I think.
Adventures in Nutopia, presented by me, Dr. Bramwell, and my exuberant sidekick, Mr. Green the Woodpecker. Alright, give it a rest. A few years ago, I began to feel some discomfort in the upper right-hand side of my chest. It was particularly acute around Christmas and New Year. On the advice of my acupuncturist, I went to the doctor. I was in there for a little more than 5 minutes, asked a few questions, and some tests were set up. After some blood tests, an endoscopy, deeply unpleasant, don't recommend that, and ultrasound, they discovered I have polyps growing on my gallbladder. This, I learnt, is not good. The specialist told me that if they continue to grow beyond 1 centimetre, this would significantly increase my chances of cancer, better to have the organ whipped out. I was reassured that surgery was straightforward and that I'd be fine without a gallbladder. I was pretty keen to hang on to it. It's the only one I've got. During those few months in which I saw doctors and specialists, not once was I ever asked about my diet, lifestyle or emotional state. It's not just festivities that make some of us binge or turn to junk food for comfort after all, though in my case it was largely due to living the good life. The one time that I did ask a specialist what he recommended I do to go easy on my troubled organ, he just shrugged and muttered something jocular and offhand about cutting down on the whiskey and kebabs. I don't eat kebabs, and I don't like whiskey. I do, however, see an acupuncturist. Not just for the sheer pleasure of having needles shoved into my hands, toes and other parts of my body every month, but also because she's invested time in getting to know me. She knows my health, my lifestyle, my family background, my anxieties better than anyone. Every week she checks my pulses, my pallor, my skin, and she gets me to stick my tongue out at her. She doesn't differentiate between what's going on in my mind and in my body. Knowing me well, Steph had lots of useful dietary advice, what to avoid, what to favour, which by and large I've stuck to. When I feel a twinge, I know that I need to rein in my diet and lifestyle. I also get my gallbladder checked up every 6 months or so at the hospital, and to date, thanks for asking, we're still together.
Have some chips?
No, and eat your beetroot. And if something unusual needed further investigation, I know that Steph wouldn't hesitate in recommending I contact the doctor. But this episode isn't just about the benefits of Chinese medicine. Most doctors share the frustrations of a mechanised pill-popping approach to health, one whose radicalised practice may hopefully prove to be a flagship for integrating those broader aspects of mental and physical well-being, community, movement, friendship, food, art, etc., is Dr. Laura Marshall-Andrews. In 2022, Laura published a book, What Seems to Be the Problem?, exploring the drawbacks of our Western attitudes to health and how she and her team have tried to implement new approaches to health at their surgery, including the provision of acupuncture, reflexology, acquire, art therapy, and what she calls narrative-based medicine, in which the doctor's job is to find out the patient's backstory to determine what each patient might need individually. I began by asking what narrative medicine means. Go on, have a fig as a treat.
Thank you. It's also now become known as social prescribing, which is sort of prescribing things which aren't medicines, and things where you're basically kind of prescribing social solutions or cultural solutions. And when we started in 2013, every Saturday we had a singing group in the practice, and it was just so moving, and people were so committed to it, and it really changed so many people's lives. There's something very kind of powerful and joyful and communal about singing together. We run an arts organisation called HERA, which stands for Healing, Expressive and Recovery Arts, and that started off with just some friends of mine who were artists, and they just started running groups in the practice really early on. But it was incredible what effect it had on people. You read a poem or a piece of text, literature, and then you talk about it in the group, and then everyone writes for 10 minutes just whatever comes into your head, and then if you want to at the end you read it out. And it's usually autobiographical, and it normally brings up some sort of something that maybe you didn't realise you were thinking about, and it can often access things that a direct counselling or something couldn't do, and it creates a real feeling of togetherness and closeness within the group. And one of my favourite quotes is from a patient who has very, very bad inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, and he said that doing the narrative workshop helped him to see that he was more than his illness. It was a real opportunity for him to find himself, which was really powerful. And actually after that, his illness didn't go, but it got better.
The Austrian mystic Rudolf Steiner once wrote that every government should appoint a minister for aesthetics to ensure that beauty and greenery were an essential part of any planning, especially for public buildings such as hospitals and surgeries. The post, of course, would be given to an artist, not some witless politician. The importance of a good environment in healthcare is something Laura and her team have given serious consideration to. But before we hear from her again, here's Philip Carr-Gomm on the subject.
I was really struck during the pandemic listening to this very famous guy whose name I've forgotten, who was a sort of an explorer. I think he'd been to the North Pole and all the rest of it. And he'd got COVID and he almost died. He was on a ventilator, I think. He placed the point of his turnaround where he was recovered. He was wheeled out into the hospital garden, and he was there with a tree and with nature. And he gave this very lovely little talk about it that was on the radio, saying every hospital should have a garden where patients can heal. I remember on the day before my dad died, he came to stay with us in the house here, and he was incredibly frail and he was dying. And I took him out of his bed, and he just came and sat in our garden and just looked at all the trees. And it was so touching. I could just feel him kind of soaking it in, and it doing him good, and it lifting him up. So, of course, that's how I'd like to see health facilities, is really embedded in nature with beautiful trees and flowers everywhere.
When we started Brighton Health and Wellbeing Centre, we actually just borrowed a load of money ourselves and completely gutted it and repainted it and created so the waiting room looks more like a gallery. And when you come in, there's flowers on the desk, and the desk is kind of low, and it's got this like funky pink glass thing on it, and And it just looks more like a art gallery or a therapy suite or something. Loads of people comment on it, and it makes people feel like you care and like they matter. And when you walk into a surgery and there's broken machinery with an A4 piece of paper on it with, this doesn't work, or broken, and everything is dirty and unthought about, it's depressing. And it makes you feel slightly unsafe, and like people don't really care about their environment and they don't really care about you, and it doesn't really cost that much to make those differences, and they make such a difference to people.
While all of the guests in this programme agree on the benefits of relearning lost wisdom and embracing a more holistic approach to health embedded in nature and community, what of the benefits of new technology? While VR and AR, virtual reality and augmented reality, remain in some ways in their infancy, fascinating work is being done in these realms, particularly with regard to mental health, phobias and pain management. Sarah Ticho works in interactive media, exploring the intersections between VR, art and well-being.
There's quite a few different ways that VR can be used in healthcare. So it's used a lot in mental health, from anything from teaching you how to manage your anxiety and teach mindfulness, to how it can be used in phobias and exposure therapy. It's used a lot in physiotherapy as well, getting you to actually do those exercises and make it fun and improve adherence.
Can you give an example then? Can you talk us through how someone might face severe phobia?
So there was an amazing project done by a researcher called Daniel Freeman at the University of Oxford, and they created a whole series of VR experiences for people with psychosis and severe agoraphobia, where they were essentially homebound or found it really hard to go out the house, to go to places like the job centre or even get on a train. And so what they did is they created these experiences that enabled them to safely do it from home, and being able to kind of practice this in a safe environment alongside some sort of healthcare professional as well. So it's almost like this training camp where, it's not real, but also it feels really real. There are other things like more playful experiences, like there's something called Richie's Plank, which is really fun to watch people respond to, where you're just literally walking along a plank 100 metres in the air and just seeing how terrified people are and how they respond to that, I think really demonstrates how immersive these things can be. So I think there's that sort of replicating reality, and getting people to be comfortable in situations that perhaps they're not comfortable with. Public speaking's a really big one as well.
Now, by chance, whilst making this episode, I was visiting friends in Spain. Their son Felix had a VR headset and a copy of Richie's Plank. It felt terrifyingly real, taking a lift to the top of a tower block and mustering the courage to walk the plank. It challenged my anxieties with heights, and doing it over and over again helped me feel a better sense of control over vertigo. In fact, by only the second attempt, I was pretty nonchalant about it. The sound in the background is cicadas, in case you're wondering.
Got my arms out.
Yep, that was my response to plummeting 1,000 feet from the top of a tower block. Pretty cool, eh? It was then that Felix told me to press some button in the lift 3 times, which came with the warning, "Do not press this button." Emboldened by having faced my fear of heights and some psychopath with a drill in the basement of the tower block, I couldn't imagine now anything in this game that would frighten me. What I hadn't anticipated was how terrified of spiders I actually am. They began to teem out of a hole in the lift. Forgive the swearing.
Oh, for fuck's sake, not spiders. I'm not seeing spiders. Oh, Jesus. Oh, fuck. Oh, I don't want to do spiders. Can we get rid of spiders?
The final expletive is when a giant mother spider starts to crawl towards the lift from the outside. Thankfully, you can't see the footage of me, almost in a fetal position at this point. It took a lot more courage to go back and face the spiders than it did to walk the plank. By the 5th attempt, my palms had stopped sweating and I got less sweary. The potential for VR to help us face such fears and anxieties is, I believe, enormous. Here's Sarah again.
Yeah, I think it perfectly aligns with social prescribing as a concept of, having these more holistic looks at people's lives and saying, you seem to be feeling really anxious. Did you know that there's this breathing game that you can play, and here's a whole virtual reality arcade that is just available and open to the public. I think it's ultimately about giving people choices, and if they don't want to use VR, there's a billion other things out there, and it's just about saying these are options available to you. But I've just seen how it's been used in these really quite incredible ways, and it feels like such a shame that is one thing that is being ignored when we still live in this very medical model world where we're giving people antidepressants and antipsychotics when maybe they need other forms of support as well. So I think it's just part of the toolkit.
We live in a pretty unhealthy, highly stressed environment. Western medicine is often very good at crisis management. If you've reached a mental health crisis and you need something that's going to help you quite quickly, then medication and doctors and that can do that. But the kind of longer term coming to terms with illnesses, working out how to change your lifestyle, those kind of things, that takes longer. So a lot of the complementary therapies and other ways of investing in your health are preventative. They are maintaining health. They're stopping you from getting ill, and it should be 90% of your time spent with doing that, and then only a tiny percent of your time do you really need to come and see a doctor.
I think it's part of this wider idea of preventative care. How can we empower people with skills to look after themselves and express themselves and explore their own emotional landscape and develop emotional intelligence before we get sick as well as after?
We will all need medicine in our lives. It's inevitable, and thank goodness, some of the greatest human minds of the generations have developed wonderful forms of medicine. But ultimately, the highest form of medicine is, if you can, to prevent disease arising in the first place. We cannot be healthy under the present food system. People eat food that makes them sick, and the way we grow the food makes the environment sick. That's not really a kind of medical thing. It's more a kind of, it's bigger than that. But if you can prevent financially in terms of pain and suffering. Medically, I'd love to see the integration of Western medicine and Chinese medicine as it is, quite widely practiced in China. Most people now, beyond a certain age, have chronic disease. And that is a result of the society we live in, the lifestyle that we follow. Much more than in traditional societies. When I was in China in the 1980s, I couldn't believe how fit and healthy most older people were. They were fighting to get on. I tell you, I was in my 30s, try and compete with a 70-year-old 5-foot-tall Chinese woman getting on a bus. And I would lose every time. They're tough and strong.
Since 2004, I've been running a monthly event in Brighton called the Catalyst Club, where people from all walks of life come and share a passion with a live audience. It's a simple setup, 3 guest speakers, 50 minutes each, and a hearty Q&A after. For some, it's also an opportunity to face any anxieties they might have around public speaking. To date, we've had nearly 1,000 speakers, and as many of our audience members have already given talks themselves, there's a real sense of mutual support. Many of us are now part of groups and clubs via things like WhatsApp. On this platform alone, I belong to a group for my street, a games club, a book club, a weekend away club, a camping club, a birding club, and a jazz club.
Jazz club. Nice.
What do all of these things have in common? Thank you, Catalyst Club audience. Yes, it's all about community. Something that Laura wrote in her book, What Seems to Be the Problem, which really stayed with me, was the maxim, hospital for repairs, health is made in communities. Friendship groups, clubs, bands, choirs, these really can be medicine for the soul. At the beginning, Philip imagined an integrated health system of the future that gave time to acknowledge our emotional, psychological and physical needs, something which Laura and her team are now practicing at their own surgery and hoping will inspire others to do the same. We can re-educate ourselves about preventative healthcare through non-Western systems such as Ayurveda and yangsheng, as well as through more recent Western systems like paganism and druidry. We can even employ new tech like VR for our anxieties and phobias. I do like Peter's 4 pillars of health, derived from yangsheng. Sleep well, don't eat anything your gran wouldn't have called food, keep moving, and don't get narky, it'll only make you ill. No pain, no gain is a motto best relegated to the 20th century. Stop before completion is an idea we welcome in Nutopia. A final thought. What if a tonic for the soul could actually be bottled or bagged and bought cheaply from the local shop? Wouldn't that be truly Nutopian? We'll leave the final word to Peter Deadman.
Tai Fu tea, well, that comes from the Chinese Dai Fu, which means doctor. And PG Tips was abbreviated from progestione, meaning for the digestion. So you had this early idea, that tea was a healthy drink. The interesting thing is that the last 2 or 3 decades, there's been a massive amount of research into tea, proper tea, which is the plant Camellia sinensis, has the most extraordinary benefits on the body. Virtually every part of the body, every tissue in the body, every organ in the body is helped by drinking tea. So
Even a tea bag by PG Tips and Tai Fu?
even a tea bag. Although the main purpose of tea and tea bags is to make a brew of tea as quickly as possible. And actually, tea requires 5 minutes of brewing to extract its most beneficial chemicals. If you leave your tea bag in for 5 minutes, you get a lot of the benefit.
Tea's brewing. Custard cream, anyone?
Oh, yes, please. Can I have 6?
No, just 1. And digest it slowly.
All right.
And don't get narky, it'll only make you ill.
All right. Keep your hair on.
You've been listening to Adventures in Nutopia, a series exploring future narratives produced and presented by me, David Brownwell, and with music from Oddfellows Casino. In this first series, we've explored the myths that shape Western culture, new myths to live by, reality tunnels, ritual, pilgrimage, agroecology, and new and very old approaches to medicine and health. A huge thank you to everyone who participated in the making of this series. More information and links to all of our guests can be found with the accompanying text to each episode. Generous support was provided by the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids and Hawkwood College of Future Thinking. We will be returning soon with Series 2. If you've enjoyed Adventures in Nutopia, please share it with friends, and it really helps if you could leave a review and subscribe.